President Daniels.
Sorry about that. I was having some issues.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. So, hey, it's 9:01, and I'll call this work session to order. Good morning. Sorry for. It's been a morning. I got my grandchild this morning. All of a sudden, it's like, oh wait.
All right. It's just the world in which we live. It's all right. Yeah. There we go.
All right.
We're here for kids, so it's good to hear that little voice.
All right. So, Dr. Watts, are you going to get us started?
I will. I just want to make sure we're all set and ready to go. Thank you very much, President Daniels, members of the board, staff, and thank you, Melissa, for tech support today. I want to thank Dr. Harmon and certainly in her time and effort in supporting our policy governance. And today, on this Saturday session, we will be taking a look or beginning with the first reading of 9 policies for this session, which you were sent earlier this week. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Harmon and look forward to our policy governance session today. Dr. Harmon?
Good morning, President Daniels, members of the board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Laramie. Happy, as always, to be working on our policies. Thank you all for your Saturday time. It's a commitment for all of us, and I appreciate that. We are going to go over 9 policies today. And as a reminder, they are listed as first reading and discussion because as we learned earlier this school year, we have to have a first reading before we can bring it to our regular meeting for action by the board. And so as we go through these, obviously it's conversation, and the next time that you see this, it would be on the agenda, depending on what progress we make and what consensus the board comes to, whether it would be a first reading and adoption or a second reading, a second reading and adoption, or a second reading and additional discussion. Each of you received your folders, and I appreciate that. That gave you an opportunity to look at those policies and make notes for yourself without violating any OPMA. And so as we go through these policies, all with the exception of one are essential policies for KSD as outlined by Wasda. Two of them are KSD specific, and as I mentioned, we would bring those forward so that we could update the legal references, even if there were no other changes. I will share my screen with the policies and the track changes visible so that we can discuss what the summary changes are. And then in that version, I will make the note changes that we discuss and that the board agrees should move forward. And then that way they will also show up as the public are following along. So we are going to jump right into this. And I'll say that at any point, 2 things. At any point, if we want to get to about 5 or 6 and we needed to take a break, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to just power through. And as a reminder, I won't be able to see your faces because there's lots of other things going on. So please feel free to interrupt and interject. It's not a problem at all. And so with that, I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. And the first on our agenda is policy 2410. And that has to do with high school graduation requirements. And it looks like a lot of change up front. There were updates to the legal references. So since the last time, and this is one that we update fairly frequently because I think like most states, Washington State also is constantly evaluating what the federal requirements are. They're also constantly looking at what's in the best interest of students across the state. And so with that, there are quite frequent adjustments to graduation requirements for students. And so the legal references were updated. So that's why this looks very busy at the top. I promise you that when you go into track changes and look at it without the edits, you see them clean and the links are active. The biggest changes here really exist within the idea of allowing students an opportunity to demonstrate college and career readiness as part of their high school and beyond plan work, which was a requirement that has been updated since our last revisions in 2018, and meet the requirements of one graduation pathway option described in the procedure. So that again allows them to continue that career and college readiness exploration before they complete high school. In addition to these, in the procedure, there are updates about regalia during graduation, because that, I think as Director Van Godaslam pointed out last spring, there were changes in the legislation about tribal students being allowed to wear their regalia during their graduation ceremonies. And so that would be present in the procedure as well. And then ensuring that the cross-references related to this were also updated per Wasda's recommendations. And that's pretty much it. And it's very interesting. So it's a fairly short policy for something that is so critical to the work that we do in the district. And I'll open it up to comments or discussion from the board.
Dr. Harmon, is the procedure not available at this point, or I was trying to find that to
so
see what's.
I apologize. I can send you all out the procedure. It's not that it's not available. I just didn't do that because I wanted us to remain focused on policy, but I can definitely provide that to you so you'll have context before it shows up for the board meeting. And it would show up there informationally anyway, but I will make sure you have it in advance.
Okay. Just want to make sure, because part of the struggle I have with policies is that when it continually talks about procedures, you know, with the policy itself, it's hard to understand. I mean, policies are great. Of course, we need them, but without really understanding the specifics and what are all the changes that are happening within that, it's hard. But I understand what you're saying about getting a chance to review it.
Well, and before you take action, I will ensure that you have, like I said, I can work this afternoon to make sure you get the procedures that are referenced here so that you all can review those. And definitely that'll allow you to have an opportunity to have plenty of time to review before the policy and the procedures show up on board agenda.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would agree, especially requirements for graduation. You know, that just section 1, it's very vague, and I understand reasons for it being vague, but you know, I would be more comfortable if there was language that says, you know, complete the credit requirements of core 24 or whatever the state is calling it, those 24 credits, and maybe even, because again, you know, everything that's in our policy is the expectation in the procedure. So if it's too vague, I get concerned that we're gonna, you know, fall out of line with something. And so, yeah, I would like some more specificity in that one line about what exactly that those graduation requirements mean. Scrolling right under there on section 1. Yeah, so it's like, if it's complete the credit requirements specified in the procedure, I'd rather have it say complete the credit requirements, you know, of core 24 as outlined by the state, or something to that effect. Don't even type that. That's just
no.
Yeah.
No.
Right. I understand. You're speaking of state, just being mindful of, and this is policy high level, so this provides the context. And I do understand the challenge where the procedure obviously provides the granularity of how the policy is implemented. But what I hear you saying is state, if we could, and I see that, Dr. Harms, state or federal requirements, whatever those are, because they certainly can change, and that's part of our policy work when laws or federal guidelines change.
Yeah, it just was a little too vague as written, you know.
So imagine, I'm sorry, I need to put a space there so it'll allow me to kind of strike through this.
Yeah.
So you'll be able to see. And this is, like I said, I understand that this is a consensus, and it is definitely a board team effort, but I wanted you to be able to see kind of how it would read if we shifted that. And I think the sentiment is, yes, we need a little more specificity with what is required. It's not just, there are federal, state, and sometimes local. So there was a time when Kent School District required things of their students that the state was no longer requiring. And so it's possible that the board could develop expectations for high school graduation that exceed federal and state requirements. And so hearing from the other board members is just something that is of interest, because then this allows the procedure to give that level of specificity for at this moment what they are. So for example, right now they're core 24. Actually, they're probably not, because we may still be living under the COVID waivers of what graduation is. But yes, so this would give us the flexibility to adapt that rather quickly in procedure, but still always be under the rule of federal, state, and local requirements.
And you could even say as outlined in the procedure accompanying this policy. I mean, if you wanted to, you could even say that and just kind of leave that. So people would know where to find it, maybe necessarily if they were looking.
Yeah, I agree.
And I was going to say add maybe by current federal, state, and local requirements, but I don't know if that's necessary.
I'm sorry, it's so hard to have a conversation and not see faces, you know. So I'm trying to toggle back in between seeing faces and doing this. There we go. So now it would, there, I think that captures what I've heard so far.
I think that captures, yeah.
Okay.
I have a question on number 3, and this is probably something that I should be more aware of, but I'm going to ask it anyway, so I can possibly learn. Could you give me an example of a graduation pathway option?
So you are testing me, and I will not pretend to be an expert in this space. No, it's not an intentional test, Director Hamada. I don't mean it that way.
I'm trying to learn.
So under the closest link that I think are related to CTE, so our career and technical education opportunities and pathways. So our students have an opportunity to explore lots of different kind of what could become later career options through our career and technology education program under teaching and learning. So I think about things like exploring our culinary arts, like exploring coding.
Can you scroll down to it, Dr. Harmon? Can you scroll down to number 3?
She's highlighting right here. Sorry, that's the space that we're talking about.
Okay.
Meet the requirements of the graduation pathway option described in the procedure.
And doesn't that include like other credit options? Because there's options like, for example, all students don't have to have 24 credits to graduate. There are other options that they can use that don't meet that requirement. So there's quite a few different pathways that kids can graduate. And I'm trying to think of where they can be found. I think they're on OSPI.
There are, and there's another way, so they're connected, and that's why I think 2418 is one of these cross-references. So if you remember during one of the last spring's policy work sessions, what the board allowed students to do is get competency-based credits. So for example, if a student is successful in a higher level course, they can back credit the earlier level course. So there's multiple ways that students can achieve credits to meet their pathways. There's even as far as students getting credit for work or other experiences outside of school. So there's a myriad of
language. Yeah, they can test out with language. They can take a test, so they don't have to meet the language requirements that are in grad. I mean, there's lots of different
military career interest is
there's
also
lots of different
post-secondary. Absolutely.
So there. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Director Hamada.
If you, just call me Leslie today, please. I would just like to, so under 2418, I could see a whole list of I want to learn about all these different, because I don't know all these pathways. So I want to educate myself, and I can find these on OSPI.
Yes.
Okay.
Graduation pathways.
So
Absolutely.
I want to familiarize myself with that. Thank you.
I'm also I'm writing so in the midst of all of this, I'm also taking other notes for other intersections with work. I always, as you all know, I write about lots of different things in my board updates. So I'm just making a note to self that this might be a future board update topic. So I just wanted to write that down as well. So thank you. So yes, so what I also heard in these requests and wanting to know more is that we want to see some of the specificity of this laid out in the procedure to ensure that it's clear, not just for staff to operationalize, but for families who are trying to get more information. Okay.
One final question on that, Dr. Harmon. Are all our kids and parents, are they educated to, a lot of times you have to advocate for yourself. And I'm wondering if all our kids, are they aware of all these opportunities that are available if they're in that situation where they're needing credits and stuff like that? Is that done through an educational process or?
So I can assure you that our high school counselors are very much involved, our high school principals as well. So it's unfair. I would say our high school staff are very much aware of what those options are. We are constantly in conversation about how they're shifting at the state and federal level and what options might be available for students. And they are constantly leveraging those. Every single one of our high school credit bearing campuses, so that includes KPA, KMVA, and iGrad, are constantly in conversations with students and with staff about what they can leverage for a student so that they can be successful, what options are available, what other experiences have they had that might give them credit. Obviously, through the high school and beyond planning process, that's supposed to help as well. And parents are communicated with, probably not as frequently as students are involved in this with staff day to day, but they're very much aware of options and constantly inquiring about what might we be able to leverage to help a student meet that goal.
Yeah, and the end of every year we get kind of where your student is and whether they're on track for graduation. And so you know, that's where you see, okay, these are the credits. And then if there's something else that you need to know or they want to speak to you about or give you other options, they're really good about sharing that information.
Well, it just appears to me if a child or a young student is struggling and they start to see that, I mean, if they could say, hey, maybe you didn't think about this could be a credit or something. And I'm glad to hear. So there is plenty of time for them to be aware of all that, right? It sounds like the counselors and other people are constantly reviewing that because a lot of kids, I mean, sometimes they just don't know about this, but it sounds like we're making sure they know, right?
So high school students, some high school students are very much aware of where they are in this process. Others are not, but there are lots of adult advocates who are part of this process. And I apologize because I don't want to make it seem like our high school administrators and teachers are not part of this in an active role. But I communicate, and because oddly enough in the state of Washington, a lot of the graduation pathway work falls under assessment, interestingly enough, even when it's not related to assessment. So we get quite a bit of these conversations in organizational effectiveness about graduation pathways and communicating with counselors. Mr. Randy Heath and his team also spend a lot of time with high school counselors working on this work. So there's constantly adults involved. We're constantly trolling the changes. And as an example, in fact, last night, Chief Vela and I were actually texting about some possibilities and some things that might be on the horizon and what might change. So we are, everyone is all in, and definitely, I would say 110% in after the start of the second semester, because it's that final dash of did we miss anything in any opportunity for a high school student, especially a graduating senior.
I will add to that, and thank you, Director Hamada, Leslie. I'll cover both bases, but I appreciate your question because I won't say it's a double-edged sword, but it is two-pronged. And what I mean by that is, you asked the question: Are all of our students aware of these opportunities? And that's a hard question to answer specifically. I understand, and the answer that Dr. Harmon mentioned, they should. We expect them to. The best that we can say is that we provide those opportunities early and often from, as Dr. Harmon mentioned, our school leaders in the form of counselors and building administrators. We have evening activities, outside of school activities, to promote post-secondary career opportunities. And I will tell you, so this is a conversation I know I've had with several of our building administrators over the last few years, is that our counselor to student ratio has been brought up as a concern of how to provide access to perhaps hundreds of students on a caseload. And that's an area where we have to continue reviewing from a staffing standpoint to make sure we can answer that question that you just asked and be assured that every student not only has the opportunity, but is receiving that information, has access to. So I wanted to make sure that was also a part of the equation.
No, I appreciate that. And I've heard that before, that the counselors are just overwhelmed. And that's why I was saying, a lot of the kids that I've worked with, I've taken them into different states because they weren't aware of it, just because, and they get so discouraged when they get so far behind that some of them just say, oh, it's just impossible, I have to give up. And I'll say, no, let's look at this. And with all the students we have, I think it's an undertaking that they're all aware of all this.
Well, and
pretty-
all of them don't have to be aware, right? Because
No,
for the
I know,
majority of our
right,
students are
right.
on the path, but there's
Absolutely.
also, each school also has a position. It is the college success person
Yes.
that is in the school building. And that person actually, from my understanding and from students I've dealt with, in particular at Kentwood, Kendall really is the one who's following up with students and making sure, because the counselors, can't always do that. And, helping our college bound kids, making sure they know what their options are. So there's other staff in the building too that help to support that. But every student wouldn't necessarily need to be made aware of this because most students are on the traditional track.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry to get off track, but this was just kind of important for me to learn.
Thank you for asking the question.
And it's helpful. It helps us think about procedural information that may need to be included. Okay, so I think what I hear is consensus is we're going to leave the changed language here about the federal, state, and local requirements as outlined. And then I made a note in the comments about making sure that the procedures had enough detail to be informing and specific for staff to operate and for families to be informed. Okay.
That's good.
So I'm sorry.
No, it sounds good.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So what I think will happen, because time, wow, moves so quickly. I believe that we may be ready to put this forward on February 10th. I will check with Ms. Howley about that as well. Our cadence is usually the information is due. It was due Friday to start building and crafting the agenda. But I think there's not a lot to do here. So it might be possible this may be seen on the 10th. If not, these will be seen on the 24th. All right, moving on to 5111. And this is a KSD only policy. We call it out separately. Wasda's language is that they expanded this into employment and volunteers, disclosures, certifications, requirements, assurances, and approvals. Before we move into the area of seeing whether or not we would like to retire this policy and expand it into 5005, I brought it to the board because I wanted to show that we'd updated the legal references, and that was important because this is a KSD only policy and we just updated the procedures. I believe on the last January, the last January regular meeting. And so what's reflected here are the legal updates and the laws that have changed. When I spoke with Dr. Behringer, right now there's not an interest to change the employment policy itself. It is broad enough that it speaks to what is required and what the process will be. And obviously HR is quite attentive to the procedures that accompany this because they just made updates to this for the board's view. So right now, I would recommend that we update the legal references that accompany this since the procedure is still active. And then as we move forward, our next scheduled policy work session is the end of March, March 31st, I believe. We can see then at that time if HR has a recommendation for merging these two policies or if they still need to remain separate, and then bringing you 5005.
Yeah. Personally, it's like if we can, yeah, I appreciate that conversation we had at the last meeting, and I do remember it. It's if we have some of these KSD, only policies that are crucial. I mean, employment is crucial. Absorbed by the Wasda policy. Oops, I'm back. Am I back?
Yes.
Am I lost?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I just think in cases like this, on something that's so crucial like employment, it might be best because then it won't fall off the radar as in future as it gets updated. If we maybe follow what WASDA is doing on this and loop it into 5005, if that's the recommendation also from HR and things like that.
So
I don't understand what you're saying, Director Behringer.
I'm saying that on something as crucial as this, to have just a KSD only policy, it can fall off the radar when we're updating things, because Wasda will update a policy and we have to look back and figure out which of our, since it was absorbed into Wasda policy 5005, you have to really be able to track. So if they send a Wasda update that says they've updated 5005, we're going to have to look at our 5005 or 5111 to see exactly where that update needs to be made, if there a law changes or something like that.
So
Just
WASDA,
streamlining the policy, right?
It's just streamlining. It would
Right.
just be streamlining it, because, you know, Dr. Harmon has the hard work of watching all those WASDA policy updates. And again, if we're not streamlined and we've got two policies, if she has to remember that if WASDA sends a policy update for 5005, she also has to look at this one too.
Mhm.
It seems inefficient.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking the same thing. I looked at 5005 and it's much more comprehensive. And it's kind of interesting, the language that they use, which one of the lines there about the board has the legal responsibility of employing all staff. And I believe we are saying hiring of all staff. That's always been kind of a concern to me, that, you know, I'm wondering how they make a distinction between employing and hiring staff. So I don't know if you caught that, but that was one big change I saw. But in terms of being comprehensive, it seems like 5005 responds to everything here. So yeah, I guess I'm questioning too why we wouldn't use that one.
so what I would suggest in the gap, and I appreciate concern for workload on my behalf, but I am also concerned about our legal gaps as an organization. And so while I hear the consensus seems to be wanting to move into 5005 and a more comprehensive look at employment, I would recommend that the board take an action on the updated legal references of this one until we can bring back 5005 and then move forward, so that there's not a gap in the meantime.
Yes.
Okay.
Just to make sure
Yes.
we're covered in the meantime until we meet again on the 31st. It will ensure that at least the legal references and things that are intended in the procedural update are current until we move into 5005.
Right.
Okay.
It'll just be a two-step process, just to make sure that we're doing the right thing.
Yes. And I did make a note that the board has interest in seeing that in March when we move forward.
Yes.
So,
Thank you.
I totally agree with that, but I have a totally different question, because I'm reading these policies so much more careful than I ever have before. And the first sentence there, the board has the legal responsibility of hiring all district employees. How can I, as a director, have the legal responsibility of hiring all district employees when I only have approval on the final candidates?
Yeah.
And
You
that's,
don't though. You have
that's what
approval
that
over
means,
numbers and staffing, and I mean,
Correct.
we have approval. It's a broad approval,
yes.
but it's not each individual. I think that's the problem, is you're thinking about it as each individual hire, and that's not the case. We approve staffing numbers.
approve personnel.
That
Yes.
is what they're talking about.
Right.
But that's not clear in that sentence to me. So,
and so maybe that's where the benefit of moving into 5005 would help. Because I
Yeah.
think as a board, you all have legal authority over a broad spectrum of the employment process. So for example, like I said, from the budget, which ties to staffing, from the personnel reports that show up there. So although it may not seem that way, but when employees retire, when they move, when they change positions, they do show up there as personnel actions on the personnel report. And obviously through executive session, you hear about candidates for employment in those administrative positions. So it may not be every single one of the employees in Kent School District comes before the board, but you do have broad oversight over the and authority over the hiring process, or over the hiring process.
Yeah.
I
So
think my problem is, like, if I were a community member reading that and I had multiple issues or something with the district or something like it has happened, I would say, well, board director, you had control over this. This policy states that. So why didn't you get involved in that? I mean, in some incidents, this stuff needs to have more detailed information to me. I'm not going to die on this cross, but I just, it's just interesting.
Understandable about the language, Director Hamada. And I think this is also an opportunity for education and edification. We really just driving home what this really means. And so that when, if that happens again, and a constituent or community member says to you, why can't you, or why won't you? You can now say, part of my responsibility is from a global standpoint. You are responsible. Board as a whole is responsible for hiring and helping them to understand what that means. It would be impossible for you to be responsible for hiring every individual or be a part of every interview process. And that's unrealistic. And that, I think, that's just one way to help our community understand the intricacies and the nuances of board governance. But no,
it's not evaluating. So it's the legal responsibility of hiring. That doesn't mean we're managing. It doesn't mean we're evaluating. It doesn't mean, so there's that whole other piece that you would refer to a constituent and say, you know what, this is this person's, refer to Dr. Watts, and he can make sure that the person who is supervising or managing that person takes care of it. That's the thing. Hiring is one piece, but there's a whole other piece of managing, supervising that we are not.
I think 5005 is responding to some of that by talking about employment versus hiring. And so I would kind of urge us to find out why it is we made those specific changes in 5005 versus this. Because I agree, I don't like the word of hiring, regardless of what it means or is intended. It's not very clear. So, I'd like to know what drove the decision on 5005. The changes on there.
Hold on just 1 second, and I can give you more information about that.
Yeah, that would be helpful, because I found that was interesting. Why did they go in and change that? There must be a reason for that.
Alrighty.
Talking about employing all staff, and I don't know if there's other verbiage there on processes as well.
I apologize. I'm trying to quickly.
I just think that the clearer we can get to the public, and the clearer that board directors, including myself, and maybe all of you are really way ahead of me probably, but when somebody asks me and says, well, you're in charge of this and you can do this, and I'm going like, but that isn't what it really means. I mean, it's just difficult. It's just difficult.
So, hold on just 1 second. I lost it. So I will share my screen with you. I went into the Wasda does the legal and policy updates quarterly. Would be the best description of typically how frequently they come out, unless there's a substantive change that is an emergency. And the last one referenced was in July 2018 regarding 5005. And so I'll just share with you that section and what it states. It appears that there were a new engrossed substitute bill that amended some of the RCWs that are even referenced in our policy, repealed some others, and it spoke to the significance of background checks in the process for all staff, not just and volunteers, not just certain certificated staff or other pieces. And so it worked on who has, like I said, regularly scheduled unsupervised access to students, certification requirements for certificated staff, what reemployment looks like for some classified staff. And so WASDA says that they made significant edits, so much so that they removed the procedure from 5005 because they feel like the policy was so specific and expansive, it took care of the procedural needs. And so at that time, there must have been significant expansion and changes to that bill. So that's why at that time they moved. And if you check the dates, I believe that our 5011 was last looked at in 2006. So there's been probably quite a bit of movement in employment law in Washington State since 2006. So.
And it's interesting because also what I know is most boards don't approve positions. So like the way that we're brought administrative positions and stuff, that doesn't happen in a lot of districts. That's strictly with the superintendent and the staff.
So I like the verbiage. I don't know, I guess I'm confused because this doesn't specifically talk about the board has the legal responsibility to hire. It talks about the federal immigration law compliance for staff, whereby we do have a legal responsibility of employing all staff, it says. So there isn't, not a concern, but there's a question about what exactly that means, because initially it was saying of authorizing the employing of all staff. And so some of those changes are very interesting to me. I'm wondering what's driving them. And then at the end on board approval, it does say all staff members selected for employment will be recommended by the superintendent.
Right.
So, so I feel like it's more comprehensive than this 511, which to me doesn't really sync with what I'm
This may
seeing.
be an option. I appreciate sometimes the meaning is either lost or captured or understood in one particular word. And just doing a quick search on pure definitions of the difference between hiring and employment, and depending on which search engine or which dictionary, you're going to find different definitions of the two, how we interpret it. Really, oftentimes hiring is viewed as the initial step after recruiting. When you've made that you finalize that relationship between an employee or the staff, the individual, and the organization. And employment is sometimes viewed as everything that happens afterwards. So from recruit for onboarding to payment and to salary and benefits and professional development, all of that is a part of when the individual is a part of the organization. That's one definition. I'm not saying that is how WASDA viewed it, but that to your point, that may be why some of the decisions to change the verbiage were made. I just think we just need to do a little more investigating, maybe with Washington State Personnel Association, School Personnel Association. They may have some insight as well. President Daniels, I know in your work you have some thoughts as well, or may want to follow up and help us understand from your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think again, it's that Ken just does things differently than so.
I understand.
So it's and good, bad, or indifferent. I'm just saying that.
Sure.
I think the way that I read it, I think of employing, and like I said, I know there's a whole lot that goes after that. So, again, it's just we are responsible for basically setting the conditions, in my opinion, of how our staff works and all of these policies that we approve, especially when it comes to hiring and, job description, all of those things, right? All the job duties, all those things, we're kind of responsible, I think, for making sure that those that are employed, they meet. That's, I think, is what our role is just making, we're not necessarily responsible for, I hired a bus driver and that bus driver's doing, that's not our role. It is more of the higher level with regards to processes and procedures and things like that that are in place to support our employees. So, it's just, and you're right, it can be interpreted however, but I think the legal responsibility means we make sure that we set, we go over what are expectations of, student staff boundaries, right? Those types of things. There are things that are set that I think those expectations in place. I think that's more of our making sure those are in place, making sure we have things around fingerprint. I mean, just making sure we're adhering to the laws of the legal things that are required for employing, but not the direct employment and day-to-day involvement. That's not us.
And
But
I believe, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm wondering though, to try to make it ultimately clear, and I know that would take a lot more work than we want to do today, but I just think explaining that better and actually doing it, I mean, the more we can get clearer in our words. I just don't see that in either of these policies where it's written.
I would agree that it's somewhat implied, but 5005 I think does
Implied.
a better job of talking about legal responsibility for employing, and then it defines that the responsibility of the day-to-day operations of that live outside of the board.
Right.
But there are the checks and balances. So for example, it says here that the responsibility of administering the recruitment process is assigned to the superintendent or designee, which would be Director Behringer. And I know that annually HR presents a recruitment plan to the board of how they intend to go about that process. So the board is involved, although again, they don't sit in on every interview and all of those pieces. All of the components of the hiring process are brought to the board. Even when there is legal action involved in dissatisfaction, they are brought to the board.
Yeah.
So,
but I think this policy is clear, actually, a lot clearer. That's just my opinion. The 505 or 555005.
So
I'm
sorry.
So if I'm correctly tracking this, so bringing 55111 to us is just a stopgap. We just need, it's just changing the laws, and then in March we're going to look at 5005 and 511 and potentially combine them into 5005 and take the language from 511 and put it into 5005 and clarify this. But you just, Dr. Harmon, have identified that this is an important gap that needs to be closed until such time as we can combine both. Is that what's going on?
That is my recommendation, because that's the whole policy is our rule to follow, and it's bound in law. And so if our laws that are referenced are not updated and current, we don't have, our staff are not following the appropriate actions based on that law in the meantime, especially since procedural updates just occurred to 5111 2 weeks ago. Right. That would be the recommendation. So to ensure that we have coverage in the 4-week gap, that we move forward on 5111 and just the legal references, knowing that 5005 is coming. If in the meantime, if it makes the board more comfortable in that 4 weeks to have the introductory language here about the legal responsibility and the designee, we can move that into 5111 in the meantime, but it still doesn't change. The recommendation would be to move into taking a hard look at 5005 as the new policy.
Okay, I'm good with that.
Yes, that sounds good.
So what I'm hearing is we like the introductory language here about the initial kind of hiring and employment process, the board's role versus staff role, as a temporary addition until we come back and look at 5005 for adoption.
Yeah, and keep in mind, Dr. Harmon, I mean, that title doesn't exist. You know, the federal immigration law compliance for staff doesn't exist in our current policy 5111. So
but it does exist in process because we're bound by bound by federal law. Let's count that. Yes. So okay. And so we, instead of this piece, believe what we're saying is we like that. I'm just going to make a comment so everyone will know the why.
Yeah, there's a good chance that 5111 will just be for 4 weeks until
Right.
we can have a bigger conversation combining side by side and what needs to be changed. So it's, yeah.
All right. So I think we've reached consensus on 5111. In the meantime, we're going to keep the KSD model policy, KSD only policy work going for just one more second at 5320. And it's a similar condition, meaning that it is a KSD only policy. I'm gonna just remember to share my screen so you can see it too. And it's similar, so it deals with personnel leave. The formatting of this has changed. It is not the language that has changed.
So this is another KSD only policy?
This is a KSD only policy.
And is it contained in a WASDA model policy that we already have?
So there is nothing like this that I saw. I think there may be something about discharge of employees or the employment process. But this speaks to more of leave in terms of when a person can take leave and what that looks like.
Okay.
And typically, when I looked at WASDA model policy where leave was discussed, it was usually a little more broad because it's not universal. So.
And bargaining has a lot to do.
Right, I would say so. So in Kent we have 9 labor groups.
Right.
One of those is not represented, our non-represented staff, and so that means that in theory there could be 9 different kind of leave rules, if that makes any sense. And so it's a little difficult to put in a flat policy around leave when those CBAs dictate some of how that leave happens. Whether or not it's in full or half days, what return to leave looks like, under what conditions certain leave, under what conditions certain leaves of absence are allowed.
There's a lot.
Right.
Yeah. And this doesn't even, and I'm assuming that this doesn't even include medical leaves or things like that.
Right. So this is more trying to address just the generic kind of personal request of leave or your discretionary leave. And so I think for those reasons, that's why WASDA has shied away from a direct policy addressing leave in its broad sense when it comes to personnel, because that is discussed to a certain extent at the bargaining table.
Yep.
So looking at cross references, there seems to be a number of policies that address those specifics.
Because leave sharing is another one of those that is not necessarily KSD specific, but is usually organization specific on who you can donate leave to or give leave to in certain instances. And again, when we're talking about our represented labor groups, it is not necessarily the employee's decision or the employer's decision to set that leave. That is negotiated and comes to as a compromise at the bargaining table.
I apologize. I might be looking at something else. I'm looking at cross references. There's about 7 under what's in our file, where the edits are. I don't see any.
I apologize.
Do I only see 1 here? Yeah, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Let me
7.
apologize. Let me see.
Yeah, there's 7.
Give me just a second and I'll be able to see what you see. I apologize for that.
That's okay.
It gets a little bit difficult sometimes when trying to make sure that each of you have your own folder. That's exactly the same. And then I also have a duplicate of that folder so that nothing is violated, but there's still a copy to take notes. So hold on just 1 second. I apologize.
You can go to mine if you can get in there.
Alrighty. Okay.
So while you're looking, I just, because it's like leave of absence to me. I didn't even imagine in a school district that because it's like that's covered by federal and state laws typically. So, and if this is only again, a KSD only policy, then it's,
And because we have 7 reference.
yeah. So it's just interesting to me, especially if some of these.
Board, I owe you a tremendous apology. Apparently, so this is another difficulty, and this is my oversight. So 5320 is a KSD only policy because in WASDA model policy, it is numbered 5400.
Okay.
And so what I was showing you, and I apologize, was the model from WASDA 5400 and not our 5320. And so I apologize for that. What you see in the changes does reflect WASDA's model language to be more broad than what's here. So they tend to take a broad approach to this and recognize very clearly the collective bargaining agreement process and the things that could be addressed in that process. And I don't think I'm sharing my screen, so you can't see what I see. I apologize again. I'm just scrolling through and kind of pointing things out. I was like, no one is walking with me.
But you were talking it through, so
we're paying attention.
Yeah,
we're listening.
we are.
Right, but everyone else who's watching along has no clue what we're talking about. So here's that
Very
version.
good.
I apologize. It is 5320, and that is KSD only.
Okay.
What it looks like here is that there are significant cross-references. We cross-reference all of the things that are related to leave. So vacation, holidays, military leave, leave sharing, family, medical, and maternity leave, emergency and discretionary leave, and sick leave. And again, each of those cross-references also, to a certain extent, are discussed and negotiated at the bargaining table. And so here, what they've, interestingly enough, when WASDA did provide updates to this, they never noted that it needed to be renumbered. Okay. So it talks about upon the recommendation and in accordance with the law, granted leave unless the collective bargaining agreement provides otherwise. Okay. So it says for collective bargaining agreement first, and then these things are possible if the collective bargaining agreement does not address these or leaves it open to the district. And it just clarifies that leave at full pay is stated, and that's typical. Units in full or half days. What it means to return from leave. And each of these, again, so this policy in this space right here, in its most generic form that you're seeing, would apply most likely to non-represented staff. Each of our represented labor groups would likely have some different language here than what you're seeing in their CBA.
So for non-rep employees that see return from leaves is where I would have any concerns because of the language of return to the position held when the leave commenced or to an appropriate comparable position. An appropriate comparable position might involve a change in, working hours or location, things like that. So that's where I would be concerned, because by law, if you're taking a sick leave or things like that, or I'm sorry, if you're taking a leave that isn't a sabbatical, if you're taking a leave that's covered by the federal government,
yep.
And then you're supposed to be able to go back to your exact same position. So that appropriate comparable position is the one where I think it might open us up to any legal risk, especially if it changes. Like I said, if you're working in an office at one elementary school, and then the appropriate comparable position is to work somewhere at a different school, or work different hours, because it's, things like that we could run into legal risk, I think, with that language.
And so although this and the version that I was showing previously reflect Wasda's language in 5400, I think this would be an opportunity for me to channel Mr. Reynolds, who would say that sometimes Wasda's models are written broadly.
Yeah.
And so what I made a note to do is maybe not take an action on this right now, but maybe have Attorney Leonard or the staff there take a review of this and make a recommendation if there needs to be a change.
Right.
Or some specificity about the differentiation of when this applies. Because I also say that the rules might be different for labor groups. So I can imagine this, so although it gives a general clarifying statement at the beginning about collective bargaining agreements, I can see this being played out very differently across those 9 groups.
But it's also shorter than 20 days, which we typically might sub if we need that. So we don't replace, I'll say in my experience, it's usually a sub if there's anybody there. We don't hire someone to replace that position. So that's not really, at least in my experience, it has been an issue with under 20 days. And that's what they're talking about, shorter than 20 days. So I don't think if it's a leave and we know they're coming back, we're not going to replace that position. We would put a sub in there if necessary or whatever, according to the bargaining agreements. But yeah, I have not heard that be an issue because of the time duration. I don't know we've replaced anybody. We've not hired somebody to replace somebody that's going to take a 20-day or shorter leave.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm just projecting my own experience on that, but sometimes I know employees leave. In my past world, employees have left because of a disagreement. They take some leave because they're having a disagreement with a supervisor or something like that. And then, I see that could open it up to potential retaliation or something like that, where it's like the employee was having a problem with their supervisor. They decided to take a leave as per policy, and then didn't have their job back when they came back, even though it was 20 days or less. It's something
that rarely happens in the application.
Just that there is that.
Yeah. There's a lot of, that rarely happens.
Yeah.
It's amazing how guaranteed positions can be.
Yeah, but not non-rep positions. And that's where I think that, we've gotten, in my experience, even in this district, we have gotten into some situations.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about, when this new when this Wasda policy came out, because Ms. Winters edited this March of 2020. So I'm wondering if the WASDA policy is now incorporating all of this language or any of this language, and could it be then combined?
I am going to pull up and share with you my screen. I'm logged into WASDA and their model policy language. It is, I would say, no, only because, let me share my screen. It looks like this is a prime example of having the board review a policy to see if there are philosophical updates or anything needed. But even WASDA's model around personnel leaves has not been revised since 2011. Okay. And so what I have noticed with the updates that have been done, we always have to try to do an additional read and check to ensure just that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed before submitting this to the board. But it looks like it's the same kind of generic space The only legal reference is that it talks about compensated leave and those limitations, and then hiring and discharging an employee as it relates to when they transfer between districts. It leaves a lot of that latitude, assuming those collective bargaining conversations. And then, like I said, typically you would see this space take precedent when we're talking about our non-represented staff.
Okay, so the legal references we would need to add pretty much, but everything else is the same, you're saying?
Yep. So what I'm hearing is that maybe we want to take an additional look at this before the board takes action for a little more discussion. It seems like maybe I'm reading it wrong.
Yeah, no.
Any thoughts or suggestions? Yes.
Yeah, in that section C, that's where I think I would like to have someone look at that for any potential legal risk.
Okay.
Well,
Noting that, Dr. Harmon.
if they find adjustments to C or not, we could still go ahead with this, right?
Well, what I would hate is that it be reviewed and so what I can say is likely to happen is we'll have the review and those recommendations will be made and that'll be presented to you at the next time you see this. And it might be a second reading and continued discussion before you take an action on that. You see what I'm saying? So it doesn't mean that you won't take action. It's just that next time would be with that feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this could be brought to us at the next board meeting when you bring policy. It would just be actually a first reading. We wouldn't vote on it. We would just have a first reading to look and discuss any changes. Yeah.
Nope, this would be a second reading, but it would be continued discussion. So it would not, the recommendation would not be to adopt or take any action other than continued discussion with a review. That's why I was like, I want to be, I'm trying to learn remind what Attorney Leonard said. Well, it's got to be a second reading when it comes to the board at a regular meeting. So it would be a second reading, but it would be continued discussion and no action.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I know I'm trying to track it too. Thank you so much for the clarity.
That's what I'm trying to make notes for myself too of like, okay, so what are we doing here?
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think it would delay it too much. I think there would be time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay. I just want to be clear that what's showing on our board docs, making sure those legal references do show up, because in the edits on our 5320 it doesn't. So
hold on, I'm now going to go into our board docs and see what is showing to the public and facing public, and then I'll show you.
Yeah, I don't know if that's what I was looking at for you, Dr. Harmon, just now. It looked like board docs, but if not, then
let's see.
Please ignore.
Believe it or not, Wasda also uses board docs as their tool to manage their model policy.
That might be what I was looking at.
Right. So I apologize. Okay. I was toggling through. Yes, I have to be careful what one I'm in. And so if you see my screen now, it says Kent. Like you see, it's our address. It's our board docs, Kent School District. Okay. And this is our 5320 personnel. I'm sorry, 5230. Look at me.
Yeah, so the 5320 in our files didn't have all those legal references there.
No, it does not. Ours is extremely sparse.
Yeah, so that's why I was. I mean, it has the cross references. It's up on top, the essential, but it doesn't have. I don't know if it was added. It's in blue, so it might have been added.
I would make another recommendation. Like I said, this will come back to you a second reading and discussion with the outside legal review, as well as possibly additional commentary from, from HR as a recommendation of moving into the Wasda model version.
Okay.
And renumbering as well, probably?
Yes. That's another part of this process, is ensuring that we are in line with our governing body in terms of referencing model policy. So renumbering would also be, and I did make that note earlier, to 5,400. So this is definitely one that is moving forward for second reading and discussion, not ready for action at this time.
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop screen sharing. Okay. I'm going to move to our next policy that we're going to take a look at. This one is the use of tobacco, nicotine products, and delivery devices. That the policy has changed names. The name change is mostly due to the expansion of how tobacco and nicotine are smoked. So we had to, since our last updates and Wasda's updates as well, vaping, so it's not just smoking of cigarettes. So it includes all of those smokeless electronic versions of and vaporizing devices as well as being prohibited. So you see a lot of that expansion language there. So it's not just tobacco products on school property. So cigarettes, cigars, snuff, smoking tobacco, smokeless tobacco, electronic smoking and vapor devices.
So this 500 feet of schools, within 500 feet of schools, well, it says I'm unstable, but I'm just kind of questioning how realistic that is. So if there's a neighborhood, if there's a nearby restaurant, what happens there? We're responsible for that.
So
It just seems.
Because I think about how like the neighborhood is right behind like Kentwood. There's a neighborhood that shares a fence with Kentwood, and so thinking about that too.
I'm thinking about even at camp with all of the
Yeah,
Right.
right there as another example of like that. I think, okay, so we can make a note to look and see what, in terms of.
I think maybe just on, well, I guess on school property would probably be the best way.
Or are they defining that within 500 feet of schools? Do they literally mean the building? So the parking lot distance counts as that space, or is it from the property?
Because I mean, there's staff members that smoke too. So, you know, that's a hard part too, staff, right? I know, I think a lot of times we think about kids and stuff like that, but
Right.
yeah.
That's the only thing that caught my eye on that one.
So could it, 500 feet of school buildings, do we have anything? I mean, I know like you were talking about the parking lots, but any of our buildings, you could property, but it would be 500 feet from the building. Yeah.
You froze a little bit.
That? Yeah,
yes.
I didn't hear it.
Oh, my internet is bad today. I'm just questioning, you know, again, the 500 feet. So could that language just say within 500 feet of a school building instead of?
No, because there are houses that are less than 500 feet.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
for sure.
Okay.
Like I said, Kenwood, it might even be, the houses are probably maybe 50, 75 feet from the school building.
I know that, Kent Ridge, there's houses close
And
to that
elementary
property.
schools. I mean, there's a lot of schools that have houses that are close.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess understanding the rationale and what was the thinking on that would be helpful.
Well, isn't the law like 20, you know, out in the regular world, within 25 feet of an entrance of a door or something?
Typically, that's what it is for businesses.
Yeah, for business.
Yeah, we can't do that for schools.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, because then they'd be smoking on property.
So what I hear is interest in kind of clarity around, is it the building itself? What is it, does it mean on property? So if you do a plain reading of what it states here, that any use is prohibited on all school district property, that would imply parking lots as well.
Right.
And so I'll made a note to check and get some clarity on what that may mean.
Yeah.
Or if we have, what latitude we have. So is there a law preventing us from changing that?
Yeah, 'cause
And
we
then
can't
get to-
enforce that, right? We can't enforce what someone does on their private property if it's within.
Right.
Right.
So,
And just to give context, 500 feet is about 166 yards. So if we think just a little bit longer than your
Football field.
average football field with end
Yeah.
zones, I mean, that's a significant amount of space,
it
right?
is. Mhm,
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
mhm.
More dense,
I'm
dense
sorry.
area.
How does that apply to public sidewalks that are owned by the public?
That too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that too.
I mean, it gets interesting because, it's like thinking of like where Ridgewood is, right in the heart. Literally, there's houses right next door. So if someone is in their backyard smoking, they would
Mhm.
ostensibly, kids walking to school would pass by them within even 25 feet. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it adds the language, community members will be
Mhm.
prohibited. Is that within our purview?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not.
Like, what?
No,
That doesn't make sense.
no,
The
no.
addition of community members and then,
But I could also see it as, if again in certain situations, if a neighborhood is so close to a school, if a backyard is so close to a school and someone's, sitting out there smoking, either tobacco or any other substance as kids are walking into school, right by the sidewalk where the kids are walking into school, I could see that as an issue,
That we can't control.
I know,
Because it's on
right?
their private property, right? So that's, I
Yeah.
think just clarity would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I take walks around the neighborhood and it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Right.
And I didn't
Yeah.
see in this case any identification, and maybe I'm missing that in my review. Is there, Dr. Harmon, do we recall any signage requirements? Because that would be the difference, in my opinion, if we're talking about adherence, is because there's the law, or there's the policy, the recommendation, and then there's accountability. How would you hold anyone accountable, like we're talking about a neighbor or
Mhm.
a citizen who's living on their private property near a school within?
yeah. How
Well,
realistic is this?
Well, there's a little
Yeah.
bit of clarity here that existed in the previous version of the policy. So in our current version, it says, and Wasda did not update that, and theirs either, that we provide notice
Right.
of what the rule is. So posting of signs in appropriate locations, usually at entrances of buildings or exits. And included in that, it's included in employee and student handbooks. And it says here, the last line, which isn't changed by WASD either, that employees and students are subject to discipline in violation of this policy. It says nothing about community or any of that. But I did make a note to check and see what is the district's responsibility and authority in regards to private property.
I appreciate
or,
that. There's
Because
letter of
employees
the
and
law.
students live close to, though, right?
Yeah, I understand.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And this
I
is where
mean-
we get into the letter of the law versus the spirit of the
Right.
law. And I think it's much like what we're going through now with all of our mitigation strategies for COVID, right? These are,
Mhm.
if we're doing this well, we should be able to prevent. And I don't know that there's as many people smoking now as there were 20,
Oh, they're
40,
vaping all
50
over
years
the
ago, or
place.
vaping, yes, but that's
Yeah.
there's new opportunities that present
Ways
every
to
day.
smoke. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So for clarification on this, because again, I don't know what is going on with procedures on this. A kid is in the bathroom vaping. What's our procedure on that?
So that would likely show up under discipline.
Right.
And discipline policy, not necessarily under procedures here, discipline policy and procedures. And that's why it references the student handbook and the employee handbook. That's typically where those things are outlined, and usually even in the annual notices to parents and students.
Right.
It's usually where that lives.
Okay.
And so definitely forewarned before action is taken.
Yes.
And if I'm correct from conversations with community members, bathrooms have been closed because it's not happening. Kids are going in there and vaping and they've had to close bathrooms. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I just asked.
I'm not sure. I mean, you may have a specific example we can talk about,
Okay.
at another time, but I'm not aware of.
And that's not a general
That.
practice typically. I
Right.
mean, it could be at that time someone was in there, so they closed the bathroom so they could figure out how to better
Right.
monitor what's happening in the bathroom.
Or maybe there
But
was an
I don't, that's not a
investigation or a fact
broad, it's
finding.
not a broad thing that happens.
And then that, but that brings up a good point, because what about, I can't remember, does it cover school buses too? Because I have heard that, vaping occurs on our school buses as well.
That's
Mm.
property. It's
School
district
buses
property.
are
and
So that's
school
vehicles.
property. So it's
And
covered under
vehicles.
property.
It talks
It
about
absolutely is.
vehicles.
It's
Yeah,
a specifically district-owned
Okay.
vehicle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that I would say that a bus is a district-owned vehicle.
Yes, I would say. Okay, good.
Um,
Yeah, I couldn't remember, and it wasn't right in front of me, but yes, good.
I think that, like I said at the beginning of this, that's the biggest change and really intent of the changes here. So while ours had not been updated in a while, the reasoning for even Wasda's updates to this were to cover that space about the vaping and electronic and e-cigarette and all of those pieces. So gone are the days where youth especially are smoking cigarettes. It's that gap in between, because technically they weren't in violation of the rule if it says no smoking cigarettes.
Right.
Right.
And so that's why this is expanded in that way.
Yeah, and I also see this as covering a larger group of people, not just students. I mean, it's talking about the adults also, by saying staff, visitors, community members. I mean, that's extending it quite a bit, but
It always applied to staff though, didn't it?
Yes.
yeah,
always
so
applies.
I'm saying to adults, meaning visitors and whoever comes into the property. It's not just students.
Well, and it's an expansion of any time. So if we are renting the building to an organization or allowing them to use the building without cost, it still says that they must follow these rules.
Or extracurricular activities outside of the instructional day.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the point was it's not just students.
Absolutely.
Worried about.
So I heard a
Well, I mean, I'm not sure our community is aware of all this, but it's interesting.
Well,
Parents would be parents because it's sent home. It's shared. I think community members is typically not broadly shared because they don't.
I'm just thinking of things that have happened that I'm aware of.
Well, we do have signage at our doors.
I know. I've seen the signs. I've seen them.
Yeah.
And there is a process when an outside entity would like to use our buildings.
Right.
And they are not excused from following rules and regulations when that happens. That does not mean, none of us are perfect people. And so that's why there's a clause even in here about what happens when there's a violation, because sometimes that does happen. But it is all inclusive of that.
Yeah.
And there is a statement, certainly a legal statement that most certainly first year law school professors and school law, and especially I remember teaching this in middle school, that ignorance of the law is not a defense, right? So
Right.
I mean, that's true. The reality is we just need to do our very best to inform our public, but our public also has a responsibility to ask or to find out.
Yeah.
I just find that very interesting.
I understand.
So because we have some questions about the district authority and responsibility and want some feedback or some recommendation there, I would say that likely the next time you see this would be a second reading and continued discussion, or at least update of what that is before the board takes an action. So I would recommend a second reading and discussion for this the next time you see it, rather than second reading and taking an action.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Does that seem, based on the discussion I've heard? Okay.
Yes.
So that's the note I've made. All right. Is everybody doing okay? We're still hanging in there.
I appreciate that.
I said we're approaching the halfway mark.
Yes,
so
you know, we're really good schedule, good timing right now. So
yeah, doing good.
Okay. All right. So we will move on. All righty. I think next on our agenda was 5001. And this is the only policy in this set this go round that is not an essential policy. This was encouraged, which is the next level down for Wasda from an essential policy. The reasoning this was brought forward when I took a look is one, it was a cross-reference to the personnel pieces that we were discussing employment. And it speaks to their rationale for including this and recommending it to us as one to adopt was because it helps to address the teacher shortage and what that space looks like and bringing back retired employees under the system and what that looks like. And I thought about where we are with COVID and the need to have staff that are willing and available participate always. We have a shortage on our best of days without pandemic.
So, and Dr. Herman, I didn't see the attachment on this, so I didn't get a chance to review this one. I didn't see it in our folder anyway, but I'm just wondering if it speaks to classified employees. For example, someone who's, I'm not talking about teachers necessarily, but like an athletic director or somebody who comes back from retirement and we don't go out for proposal or a contract. Someone who's retired and then we're bringing them back to the district. I'm just wondering if this particular one addresses that, because there's been inquiries about where we have somebody has retired who's been here for 30, 40 years, and then we bring them back without any reviews of who else might be interested in that position.
So this does clarify that. I hope you can see the screen and it's large enough here when it gets into the district responsibilities around this. So the first section, talks about the rules around how this would impact the retiree's retirement under the state law. So if they're collecting into retirement, how many hours can they work, all of those pieces, so that we are within legal compliance of being able to pay them and what the impacts are on their retirement. And then in the next section, it addresses the things that you just brought up, Director Vangadaslam, here with the district responsibilities. And it speaks to the maximum employment of being 1 year, a non-continuing contract or appointment, so that it can be reviewed again. And so although it doesn't say the why, meaning that is there a full-time employee who might be eligible to do this? Because typically when retirees return to work, it's usually at a part-time status. Because otherwise it disrupts their retirement, and that usually is not something that they want, or else they would not have retired. And so this then allows this to be reviewed. It also speaks to the connection and intersection with collective bargaining agreement. So it speaks to what that would mean and having those conversations too at the bargaining table of if these positions are, because it depends on what position we're filling with a retiree. They may fall under a labor group, a represented labor group. So that also plays a role in this.
Yeah.
And it's usually temporary, right? So we typically do this when we're just temporarily trying to find a need. And I think a lot of times we do go that direction when we've exhausted all of the other options within our district currently.
But in the case of our district, it hasn't been temporary. So I just want to make sure that it is covered somewhere. Like, when was this updated? I guess I'm curious.
So this is WASDA's, their most recent update shows that I apologize for jumping all around. It says here that it's 2016, but that cannot be correct because they reference a change in the rules in 2020.
And it was listed as essential in WASDA. Down at the bottom, is this the WASDA policy? It says essential.
Yes, and in our updates, it was listed as encouraged.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay.
This versioning is pulled straight from WASDA because we don't have it. So I pulled it directly from WASDA's website. And so if they list it as essential, and it's interesting, like I said, their revised date shows 2016, but it's referencing dates in 2020.
Okay.
Interesting.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Scrolling up, I think what Director Vengadaslam was talking about, I think it's covered in item C. There will be no prearranged employment agreement or commitment. I think that I think that covers what you were talking about. Yes, we certainly want to make sure that we open every position to people, and is this policy
Well-
because
Yeah, and I do want to clarify. I don't think it's a commitment to rehire, but if
Right.
we have done it, it should be
Mhm.
there should be some sort of term. It should be a temporary thing, and I don't know
Yeah.
if that's explicitly.
Yeah.
Well, D says it doesn't say that the
maximum of
term,
1 year.
it says a maximum of 1 year.
Mhm.
Not continuing.
So that means
Yeah.
that there can't be consideration of this. It also says,
Yeah.
And aren't there different posting requirements for all positions? You don't have to do the same thing. So, right, you can like appoint from within. There's things that you don't have to post every position outside.
no, we
Right.
don't. But if we were seeking a, yes, so this allows for an appointment.
Right. Mhm.
However, and if we were even posting this externally, we do list what we consider term appointment or term
Right.
positions,
Right.
that give a finite amount of time, so that the person looking at this knows that it's not likely to extend beyond this, or it would have to be reevaluated at the point where this particular term ends.
Yeah. I was thinking about Maya's point, though, about saying that it wasn't necessarily open to everyone. Someone was moved into the position, and I was just explaining that sometimes you can do that. You don't have to post every position. You can appoint, or you can, if you need a certain area of expertise, for example. So, like you brought up the athletic director, it could be that there was a certain level of expertise that person had that they decided to bring back in during that time. But you don't have to post. An AD is not a protected position, right? So any directors levels are not typically.
I was just using that as an example.
Yeah, but that could be why. That's why I'm just kind
of.
of explaining the why as to where it might not be posted. It might be appointed.
And it also says here that under the district's responsibilities, although they're not numbered, the second on the list says that under district responsibilities, that applicants have to be evaluated and considered equally, and identifying the best candidate who meets the needs of the district.
Exactly. That is the part I'm saying didn't always happen. And I'm using just titles as examples. I'm not specifically talking about a. So if it's not teachers, if it's classified, especially,
Right.
I'm kind of curious how that would work, because this seems to be like referencing teachers, right, up on top.
Well, we all fall under one of these plans. So they start with TRS, but they go into the others as well. So our employees fall under one of the three: TRS, SERS, or
gotcha.
PERS. So it's not just teachers.
Okay, got it.
And then it also goes into the other pieces in terms of district responsibility. We cannot make a prearrangement with a retiree.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think you can make a prearrangement with anybody. If it's a new position, if you're bringing in somebody that isn't currently working. So, if you move someone to a different position, yes, you don't have to post that. But if it's a new position, whether you put someone who is retired into it, or someone from external, you have to post that position. If it's going to be a new position, if you're bringing somebody new in, there's two separate things. Promoting from within for a position that you've identified, yes, I don't think you have to post that. But if you're going to be bringing someone in from the outside, whether a retiree or a new candidate, I believe you do have to post that.
Well, and so I can give you an example of C, in terms of, so we have a classified employee who is non-represented and is going to retire. They're not an administrator. They are going to retire. And it's a position that is currently in our budget, and it was salaried, and they retire in the middle of the year. We cannot, in the midst of preparing their retirement and processing it, make any arrangements to bring them back to work part-time.
Right.
In the same position.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what it's saying. So I think it covers a lot of the concerns that you all have as board directors of what prearrangements, what agreements can the district make without following the traditional HR process.
And that's only unrepresented mostly because, again, E speaks to bargaining agreements, and just about
Right.
everyone is covered, and there's language in there in the bargaining agreement that speaks to it.
Yes. And then the last section speaks to responsibilities of the retired employee and their obligations to disclose when they apply for a position or express interest in a position that they are on a retirement plan in Washington State.
Yeah.
They have to follow the rules under the DRS about separation, and there's a length of time that they have to be separated before they can come back into employment. And then it also speaks to them as recognizing that if they choose to come back into a position that is represented by a collective bargaining agreement, that they have the same rights and membership responsibilities, but on a one-year temporary employee. And so, like I said, Wasda's interest in recommending it to us as adding it as one of our policies was that the whole purpose and their intent for bringing it on was that it would address teacher shortages specifically, but also shortages in other positions across the district.
Bus drivers. I mean, there's lots of people this can apply to. Yeah.
Yes. That's a great example. Director Daniels, thank you.
Been doing it. So,
yes, that is a great example, actually. Very good.
Yeah.
Yes. And so that's the recommendation. I don't hear any consensus on pushback. I don't hear any major concerns. I didn't hear anything where any directors wanted additional information or feedback.
That's good.
I'm good, thank you.
All right, so I think that the next time you see this would likely be second reading and action for adoption would be the recommendation. All right, just making a note. I will make it here too. No, I don't want to put it down there, sorry. All right, we're still okay? Everybody doing well?
Can we get like 2 minutes?
Absolutely, we are doing very well on time. So it's 10:33. I'd say we could take the risk and let's say we come back at 10:45. Is that too long?
15.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I want to get some warm coffee.
Absolutely.
So
Thank
So-
you.
10:45.
Okay, 10:45 it is.
All right, we'll be back.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, able to get ready for my day.
And we're back. There you go.
Busy day. It's my daughter-in-law's birthday today, so we have
Oh,
plans at the house shortly.
Happy
so,
birthday. There we
Yeah,
go.
that's
Oh,
nice.
yay.
That's
Yeah.
nice.
yeah, had to get decent for the day. I forgot this was being recorded this morning, actually, too. I was like, oh, but it's all right.
So there were no issues. Everyone is doing just fine.
Absolutely. And we're right on schedule. So
We are.
well done. We're
Awesome.
back from break.
Yep.
Here we go.
We're going to keep powering through.
Yes.
Next on the agenda that was posted is 5201. And that's drug-free environment is what we have it listed. There's been a slight change in the name. Let me share my screen so you can see this. And they've just changed it to be specific but inclusive, the drug-free schools, community, and workplace. I think that goes back to addressing some of the same groups that we were talking about when we were just talking about the tobacco use policy piece. So that when we say schools, community, and workplace, we're meaning obviously our students, our staff, and then our visitors and other community people that may use our facilities. There were some slight updates to the legal references. And there's been quite a bit of action since the last time we updated this. Last time we updated this as a district was 2006. Obviously, in the state of Washington, there's been some language around what is still considered controlled substance that is legal and not. And so there's some clarity there. And so it defines workplace. It defines kind of district property. It gives into that specificity of like the building, district-owned vehicles, other district-approved vehicles that transport students. So alluding to the buses again, to and from school activities. So after school activities as well, or off of a field trip. Or a festival, or those, so any of that. So you don't have to be on district property and to still be under this rule and regulation. So it does a pretty good job of clarifying those pieces as well. And then speaks to what behavior is prohibited here. And so very clearly for staff, for the adults, the responsibility to maintain a drug-free workplace, school community, not reporting to work under the influence of alcohol, illegal or controlled substances, including specifically marijuana or anabolic steroids. Using and possessing, transmitting alcohol, controlled substances in any amount or in any manner at any time in the workplace. And there's an E left off here, small but important. And so, and then speaks to crime. So there's been some changes in the level of criminality. So not removing the felony language attributable to the use of or sale of any of these illegal or controlled substances. And so even if that happens outside of work, they are still subject to disciplinary action, including up to immediate termination, using district property, to make or traffic or distribute, again, and so.
Does this also cover, so like if there's a trip and volunteers, like an overnight trip and things and volunteers having alcohol, like is that would be implied as well, that if you're a chaperone for a district trip, you can't have any, be under the influence of alcohol or controlled or illegal substances at any time during your time?
So it just says here, it defines who's under this. So staff, students,
Right.
and citizens.
Right.
And although it defines workplace, it extends this to mean
Yes.
Yes.
any of these
School
activities.
yes.
Right,
Right,
school
right.
activities broadly, not necessarily just on property. So it does go
Right.
into such a field trip or athletic event, and that would include overnight. So if that event is an
Yeah.
overnight event, then it is the same thing. And you are, it's, again, so that's still reporting to work
Yeah.
under the influence.
Yeah.
And it says, then it speaks to notification requirements. So if for some reason staff are under a prescribed order for some of these medications, then providing notification of that so there's not any conflict or any problem, and providing that provision, we need to determine who that would be notified in this instance. Is it HR, in what position, or is it some other position where that would be notified? And then keeping that record. And then the obligations still remain that if you've been convicted of such crime, you have a 5-day window to notify that conviction, notify the district of that conviction, your employer. And then we have an obligation to notify the government within 10 days, regardless of the source of information. So even if the employee does not disclose, if we have evidence of that conviction, we are time bound to report it as well.
When they're speaking to under the influence, that terminology, who determines? I mean, when if I'm pulled over for too much, if I had a drink at a cocktail party and I'm pulled over and I don't blow a certain rate, I've just had one drink, or if I've taken marijuana or steroids and it's not affecting my job-related responsibilities, are you saying the person can't have, is this saying absolutely none? I understand during work, but if you perhaps before you went to a basketball game or something, you had dinner and you had, say, one beer, and then you were with kids. I mean, how do we determine that?
So it very clearly states reporting to work under the influence of alcohol or any other substance. We can continue on there. Not pretending that I am a lawyer giving any legal interpretation of that, but as an employee who is bound by this, I would interpret that to say, meaning that, so if I were, so I'll give you a real world possibility. We are back in our real world. There's a small break between the work day and work session and then board meeting. We go off campus to dinner. And technically that is my time. I'm paying for my meal, not the district. I have the option to decide to have a glass of wine with my meal or not, knowing that I'm going back to work. Personally, I would say it's a no-go. Even though I know that technically if I were pulled over, it's unlikely that I would test or blow over the legal limit. I would say I would recommend not. That's a personal choice. I think that because this is wrapped into the confines of the law, that I'd be very careful that ultimately being under the influence would be one of two definitions. Either failing the legal limit test for whatever that substance is, or exhibiting behaviors that would indicate to others that you were over the limit. And in either instance, I'd be very careful with the testing by an officer of the law with that, because typically the legal limits are set so low that your behaviors may not change. And
smells, like, I mean, you can like if you smell like you've been drinking, or that's typically how people report, right? Because they observe behavior. So that's usually how it's reported. Somebody says, you know,
I smell something,
you smell something, or see somebody acting as though they kind of look as though they may be under the influence. It's really hard, honestly. This has been really hard to, because I mean, people can be under medication and still, that's an approved medication and still exhibit some of those behaviors. So.
And that's why they've asked for the disclosure statements here of staff, just to have that on record so that if someone does report, they can say, well, they have a prescription and we appreciate you being concerned about well-being. However, there's not a violation. I think that in the examples you all gave prior, especially when students are involved, we are all models, role models, whether our youth consider us that or not. And so when we are with them and in their presence, especially on trips and things, even though technically we're not part of that activity, that behavior does matter. And so it doesn't say who's there. No, we are not giving random drug tests at sporting events or any of those things. However, this is a policy that talks about prohibited behavior. And so as individuals, we are put on notice that we are responsible for our behavior and pre-notice of what that means. And so, like I said, for me, I would interpret that as I probably would not have the glass of wine at dinner between the work day and the board meeting.
Yeah,
you know,
this
just
is
right.
Yeah, it's pretty common language in almost any organization I've ever worked. You don't go out to lunch and have a glass of wine and then come back to work. Conversely, you wouldn't go out to dinner and have a glass of wine and then go back to work. And, you know, whenever you're working around.
Unless you have a wet workplace. There's so many
Yeah,
wet workplaces
there are
now.
a few. Yeah,
There's
you
a
know,
lot.
it's interesting. It depends. Most publicly traded companies don't have wet workplaces, but some do. Yeah,
A lot
but
of
it's
them do.
but it's got to be very clear. I personally have never worked in a wet workplace, so
yeah. Most of my friends do. Technology, when they work in tech and stuff, they have
Absolutely.
bars. They have full bars in their
Absolutely.
workplaces. Yeah, it's very common, which is interesting.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's like, if you consider, especially if you're going to be, you know,
kids.
around kids in the evening,
Absolutely.
if you're volunteering for any event, you know, it's.
And I appreciate what certainly what Vice President Bettinger is saying. I think we've all said it in a different way. There's the policy about our workplace, but there's also the standard that's risen when we think about certain jobs and employment. One is the clergy, the other is certainly hospital, but definitely education. When you think about standards that are typically raised for expectations of behavior, that's something for all of us to keep in mind.
Yeah.
I just wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a good,
yeah,
it's a good conversation, because if you think about it too, with a lot of parents and people volunteer at basketball games or things like that, and they might not really think about the fact that having a wine with dinner and then going to take tickets at the stadium, it might be a thing to have that glass of wine after you volunteer.
Right.
And once you're not around kids.
Yep, for sure.
And so a lot of the other doesn't really change. I mean, so we had some language in there about notifying, again, about the conviction piece, and I think that's fairly standard. If you've been convicted of a crime relating to drug distribution, then you probably should notify your employer. And then it talks about our responsibilities to notify and inform as well. It talks about the disciplinary actions in those regards, and what those disciplinary actions are. I do believe one thing that I did not see, and I would say that federal law, state law probably supersedes this, but would want to just double check if there's CBA language that speaks to, we need to just probably have some language around CBAs, our collective bargaining agreements, because I think sometimes they are addressed in there, what the disciplinary steps are. And so in consideration with law, policy, and all those pieces, but also collective bargaining agreement. I think some of that is called out in some of them.
So Dr. Harmon, I was kind of going there too. I'm interested in this particular statement that says, as a condition of eligibility for a reinstatement, an employee may be required to satisfactorily complete a drug rehabilitation or treatment program approved by the board. I can't think of where that would apply to approved by the board. Are we approving drug rehab and treatment program? That doesn't make sense to me, that particular statement, but.
Right. We're not experts in that area necessarily to say which one would be appropriate or,
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only thing that stood out for me on that one.
And that may be similar to the conversation we had about employment, right? That there may be recommendations made by the process led by staff that the board ultimately approves. I've not personally been involved in one of a situation like this, but I know that it does occur.
Yeah. So are you saying, Dr. Watts, that that might be that we just see someone being rehired on a personnel report? Because again, you don't want to violate any HIPAA or anything like that.
Absolutely.
And that kind of goes into that area of, the HIPAA laws about health and wellness and all that,
Absolutely.
and doctor treatment.
That would be I think a common example, more common example than not. I wouldn't say it's common, but it would be a more common example that you just described. Yes.
Are we notified when employees are put on leave because of this? Because I don't recall hearing about it. Is that something the board is notified of, or no? Is that just stay in HR?
I
have to check on that. I don't recall. Yeah.
I think it just stays. Yeah.
It makes sense that it would.
Yeah.
But I think let's just to be sure. I just don't recall any situation like that we've had even had that conversation. But we'll check on that. Dr. Harmon, if you can make a note.
I did. Can I ask a clarifying question about this statement here? And I understand where the board, yes, would not be considered an expert in identifying appropriate rehabilitation treatments. But my clarifying question is, are you opposed to the idea of the participation, or just you all identifying the appropriate program? I guess that's where I want some clarification on the type of feedback I'm asking about or needing to have.
The program.
Yeah.
I might even be more comfortable if it said, or a treatment program and approved as far as the reinstatement being approved by the board, if that makes sense. If that was something that we had to, but again, I don't know that we even do that. So I've not seen that. So.
And again, I guess if this came up, I would probably, and I'm just guessing, so I guess I'm not a probably, but the only thing I can imagine with this is we might see on a personnel report that someone was placed on leave, but we wouldn't know why. And we'd approve that personnel report. And then later we would see that that person was back from leave and wouldn't know why necessarily. And that would be.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
So are you saying that as a board, you would like to be informed that an employee is being reinstated or returning to work after this? Or I guess that's what I'm trying
I don't think it's appropriate. Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay.
I don't think we need to know that.
Yeah, I think
is that a need to know?
Okay.
Yeah, I think it violates.
It's like an operational issue, and I don't know why the approved by board is in there anyway.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
That would be probably something for legal. And again, you want to make sure you're not violating it in any way.
Absolutely.
Their rights.
Their HIPAA rights.
Okay. Alrighty. So I will get a little bit of clarity. I think it's okay. I think you've reached some consensus about the language around removing the approved by board piece. But I still think there's an open question about the role of collective bargaining agreements in setting out the disciplinary action that's not stated here. So I just want to check on that before I bring it forth for an action.
Okay.
Because in every other instance, it's mentioned as part of the process, and in this one, it's not. I just want to check on that piece. So you would likely see this as second reading and discussion, at least with that update and feedback regarding those statements and where that might fit here, or if it's not appropriate or not applicable.
Okay.
All right, we are moving on. Next up is 6511, staff safety. So previously titled employee safety, it is now staff safety. I think it looks like the trend is to be more inclusive of what's considered staff. So that might be a contractor or a vendor, all of those things, who may not be a permanent employee. And so this is an essential WASDA model policy. We've not updated since 2005. Legal references were updated. Small minor updates. Again, changing the word difference between staff and employee is consistent here. Talks about requirements of who must hold first aid certificate training, and where first aid stations must be available. sites that have more than 50 employees. So just about every single one of our buildings and every entity, there must be a first aid station. And having those appropriate safety and health standards that comply with Department of Labor is now written into that space. So small edits, but important. And important that our legal references are aligned as well. And it's been a while since we've updated this. So again, essential policy.
Yeah, the only thing is staff, it still doesn't clarify, this doesn't explicitly clarify that also means, because I think technically by law, we are responsible for anyone working on our premises. And so, that could be someone from, the alarm a contractor that comes in. So I guess, just changing the word employees to staff doesn't quite clarify that we also do, I think, legally have a responsibility to anyone who's working, so if someone comes in, like I can't, if we have an alarm company person that comes in, or Otis elevator person comes in because the elevator at Northwood needs repair, we're just as responsible for their safety as we are for. So I don't know if it needs to be changed up there, but yeah.
I just didn't want to lose the note. Like, it's like every time I see this, so what do we want to?
Yeah.
So do you want to consider, so even if we don't change it in the name, do you want to expand this to say staff, vendors, contractors, or do you, I understand the concern. I'm curious what the additional language would be.
It's just, my concern is, I don't know. It's just making sure that we're following. And again, this might need legal review because if those laws are extended to cover vendors, it should be explicit. Not saying that this would ever happen, but if someone's like, oh, we don't need to provide safety for these, it's just a contractor from so and so, and not saying that would ever happen, but just to make sure we're keeping the building safe for anyone that would be doing any work on property. That kind of covers, it covers a span of things too, right? That's also, it can be covered in any sexual harassment policies, things like that. We have a responsibility. Any vendor that comes on or, our property, we have to prevent them from any kind of harassment, things like that. So safety, I think, falls under the same thing. And
go ahead.
That's it.
So I think adding a line to include all of that would be appropriate, because when I see staff, it's speaking specifically about they'll be trained in the use of chemicals specific to their respective jobs. That's not something, if a parent were to walk into a building, we would be responsible for. So putting something about those who are in the buildings and what would apply to them would make more sense, like having first aid supplies accessible to anyone in the building, something to that effect. But I think, including staff, contractors, vendors, all of that, it wouldn't be applicable to every one of those sentences.
So I agree.
Okay. Made those notes. And so what I'm hearing is that we need to have, like I said, some feedback and review on what this means for coverage for our vendors, contractors, or any other instances where KSD would have liability. And then what are the safety standards that are available to visitors, community members who are using our buildings? And so I'm sorry.
No, I think that's a perfect example. Well, our current COVID environment. And I think a perfect example of this would be contractors who've worked in several of our schools. They are required to follow the same mitigating strategies and requirements, such as wearing a mask. And so that would be certainly a clear expectation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's like, just because they're a contractor, and so the converse can be true. Just because they're a contractor on our premises doesn't mean they don't have to follow our safety protocols, which might be different from their own organization's safety protocols. That's a very good point.
So I'll get a recommendation on some language to put there and bring that to you all. And then what I'm hearing is it's second reading and discussion.
Yeah.
We're going to move right along. We've got 2 left and we're making great time. And the next seems rather simple, but I'm going to show you 2 versions of this. In this particular instance, we're talking about 6,700. 6,700 is nutrition and physical fitness. And the comments from Wasda, I should share my screen. Sorry about that. The comments from Wasda when they did the model policy revisions to this were that the changes were so substantial and significant because they'd done a complete policy overhaul in the time since we'd updated, that they did do the track changes, but to make it simple to understand, what they submitted was essentially a strike through of everything, and then a submission of WASDA model policy to follow. So that's why this was a little bit confusing, and that's why I'm going to share WASDA model policies version, because they essentially are saying it's been such a change that they recommend, rather than going through and wordsmithing and changing every single thing in Kent School District's policy, they recommend that we use the model policy from WASDA for nutrition, health, and physical education. Some of the changes that they require, that they consider significant, and the reasoning behind them is that in about 2017, there were a series of changes around the National School Lunch Program, Breakfast After the Bell, Hunger-Free Bill of Rights, and then a general consensus of moving into the direction of wellness, and how nutrition plays a role in physical fitness, physical education, play a role in wellness. And so what they've talked about is developing and having districts develop a wellness policy and a wellness committee to implement and incorporate these state and federal expectations around the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and those nutritional snack standards. The one thing that I would recommend in this, and oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. I was like, I wanted to be big enough for you all to read, but I did not mean to move that way. As they get into this policy, I think this is one of those instances where the board has brought the example too. A lot of times in model policy, it'll say the superintendent is responsible for, in the same way that it references the board. And I don't necessarily think they mean this as a literal interpretation. And so I might recommend superintendent / designee. Yes. Because although Dr. Watts bears responsibility for us following these rules and requirements, it is actually Teresa Fields, and I apologize, that is not her last name. She was married, and I'm sorry, Teresa, for not giving you your full title. But she's responsible for that because she leads that program, and the nutrition services team does a great job of making sure that those annual notices go out, those reminders. They work in conjunction with our schools and the communications team to make sure that those meal applications and that time are out there, and then processing those and getting that reporting. So there is oversight and responsibility for that, but it's not the superintendent. So that would be a recommendation for me to add that designee in our policy. But all of these pieces are there, and these are all things that the nutrition services team is responsible for under Teresa's leadership. They do the meal patterning, which our board and all of you have become well informed and by, because of COVID. We've had more discussions about what's considered appropriate snacks and meal times and meal periods, but all of that falls under this program. And the idea of the wellness policy in that committee is involving the community in that. And I think had we had that in place before, there would have been more awareness as we transitioned into a shift for COVID in our meal distributions, because families would have been more aware of kind of what the background policies and procedures and expectations were. And so ensuring that those revenues are used for the school meal program. And I always tell people, I never resist an opportunity to say a little known fact. Your school nutrition programs in a school district should run and be self-sustaining and self-supporting. And so establishing a meal charge policy. So as we do, there are rules around that, federal and state, about what we can charge. And anytime we are considering increasing the cost of meals, we bring that to the board before we do that and take that action. And so that's dealing with those pieces. And then they get into health and physical education. It speaks to the requirements under OSPI for the number of hours of physical education instruction students are supposed to receive on average, and the requirements for physical education at the high school level. And then what those requirements are for our inclusive ed students in our district. And then what it means to annually review our PE programs, what those requirements and offerings are, and based on funding, what that looks like to provide those activities for our students across the district.
So are the PE standards those 1.5 and then the 0.5, is that, does that also fall under the core 24 requirements from the state? Yeah,
Yes.
that's
Yes.
what I thought. Yes.
And then it speaks to physical activity and calling it out. So gone are the days when a student misbehaves and they don't get to participate in recess because it's considered instruction, not just play and part of a healthy component in lifestyle. And so it speaks to that very clearly and what those options might be. And so, of course, although this is a recent update from Wasda, it is not so current as to incorporate changes that may come. Sorry, so the last update was 2018. That may come as a result of how life may be different after COVID, but this is the most recent versioning of this right now.
Dr. Harmon, could you scroll back up to the certified physical education bullet?
Sorry, absolutely. I apologize.
I think it's further down.
Yeah, hold on just a second. I'm sorry, I didn't want to. Oh, here we are. Here we go. I think this is what you were referring to. Is that the space?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so this speaks to having a physical education teacher and provide instruction and support for students.
Is that a has to have or will have?
Well, it says as a best practice and subject to available funding. And so it is I would consider it a recommendation. Considering this is an essential policy, I would say it's the way the expectation, it says as a best practice and subject to available funding. It's an expectation that if it's feasible that this happen.
Yeah, because I testified on that several years ago, trying to get that into, yeah.
And we know that in Kent School District, we have multi-purpose rooms. So every school does not have the unique designated space in terms of that. And so it's not a mandate that we, tear down or rebuild facilities or add additions to every building to ensure that there's a dedicated gym where these things can happen. But it is saying that that's a best practice recommendation and as funding would allow that the space be created for this, for these things to occur.
And then that also, like, if best practice is all schools have appropriate class sizes, facilities, equipment, that also, the Learning First schedule, we know that in some of our elementary schools, the way it's administered, in some elementary schools, it's like the tripled classes. And in some elementary schools, they don't do the tripled classes and things like that. So that is something that I think is a bigger conversation for later, but.
And it's interesting that they would reference class size here, where typically that is something that is bargained,
right?
And not necessarily under the complete purview of policy,
right?
In terms of making that determination.
Well, like I said, appropriate class sizes. Again, we've seen it those doubled up classes, and so for a specialist class, because that's really what this is covering, the PE. Just the best practices to make sure to keep those class sizes appropriate. Again, so that is interesting, and I actually like that language. So,
right, and again, when I testified in the course, because my daughter's a physical education certified teacher, there's such a difference in the person that has gone into the certification teaching the class than an individual coming in. So I'm glad to see that as best practices. I mean, I think when we have 1 in 8 children under the age of 9 with obesity issues, that we cannot just eliminate physical activity and health in our school system, which a lot of people don't think is essential. So this is a big deal. Yeah. And the new standards of teaching are not just throw out the ball.
Well, and I think that that's what this calls out in the policy shift and
Yes.
overhaul, is that it makes physical education and attending to health, whether it be nutrition or general overall health and wellness, is that it is part of an instructional program and it is part of their academic program, not just play.
Yep.
She teaches a lot of nutrition in her PE classes. Yep.
Mhm.
And she lives it.
I also
So-
like that the piece we didn't talk about too is recess. It won't be a punishment. You won't be able to use physical activity as
Yeah.
a punishment either way. So that means you're also not, gone are the days where, you misbehave. So he'd run a lap, drop and give me 50 push-ups, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I am in support of not humiliating children with forced physical activity.
Where were you as board members?
I was going to
in my
say, I remember
mandate?
those days.
I know. I was thinking the same thing.
I remember them.
Yeah.
Ran a lot of laps in high school
My
for being
God.
chatty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most people were mean back then.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but it is definitely calling it out as part of an instructional program,
Right.
and giving it that weight.
Because yes.
So is the board okay with moving forward with Wasda's versioning of this? Now, what that will mean is we'll need some time as a district to work with and bring back to you a plan for the wellness committee development and what a wellness plan might look like. But that's definitely something that I think several individuals across teams would be interested in participating in. And I know Teresa especially has some plans for bringing the board a presentation of some things that she'd like to see advanced regarding our nutritional program. So I think this fits in perfectly.
I think it's great.
And
The only thing, Dr. Harmon, I noticed that 6700P was included in our package. I wasn't sure.
Well,
they
just
were combined.
because they recommended a complete overhaul, I wanted you to have reference because we haven't considered procedures yet for what this will look like. So it will involve a complete overhaul in that. And so I gave you the model of what Wasda, and they set a pretty high standard are looking for. And so as we develop that, that's not what we're bringing forward, but that's because it's attached to their overhaul. I wanted you to see.
Got it. All right. Thank you. Yeah, I saw there were some things that were empty. So, okay.
But again, it was 2006, so it's been quite a bit of time since we've reviewed this and had a good hard look at how we need to change our operations as a result.
Okay.
And just as a point of reference here, a lot of our kids have very different backgrounds and dietary things that they're interested in, not health-wise, but culturally that they would like to see maybe on. Are we addressing that at all? By, some of them are not used to these average school lunches that when they're coming into our district.
So we try to provide a robust and diverse. It's difficult now because of COVID, but prior to, we have a diverse lunch menu, and actually wanted to expand that a little bit. That's why I said Teresa is looking forward to bringing the board some ideas, which might need a little bit of tweaking now that we have COVID realities, but it's definitely interested in providing other options for our students, and especially getting pretty super creative and innovative at our secondary levels.
That sounds exciting.
Like for our students.
Yeah,
I'm
that's great
excited
to hear. Thank you.
Good.
That was a good question. Yeah, I was thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, and so then this will likely show up as a second reading and approval recommendation when you see it again. And like I said, we will keep you posted and updated on the development of procedure as well as the organization and development of a wellness committee. And so last but certainly not least, our final policy for review today on the schedule is 6890. State Environment Policy Act compliance. And our last review and revision of this was 2005. Since that time, there have been just a few updates related to legal references and requirements, and then the removal of some of these pieces. So we don't have to call them out specifically and list every single piece under the WAC. What they recommend instead is removing this very lengthy list.
That was a lot.
Yes, all of these pieces. It's like, yes, we are. And so they make a nice statement that we are paying attention to all of the definitions contained within from 197-11-700 through 197-11-799. So all 99 of them, and all of those terms. So they simplified that reading. They simplified who we mean when we say district. Obviously, we mean us, but they define us very explicitly. We keep the environmental policy rule. And then it talks about the importance of the why. So assuring healthy, productive, culturally pleasing environments, what we are committing to there. And there has been a shift in the model language across. You've noticed that they've changed a lot of shalls to will comply. And then it provides and lays out where we can find our environmental checklist, what our lead monitoring needs to be. Our requirements for public notice did not change. So although it's been a while, we at least were in compliance with what that needed to be. And then if we are involved in that, we do not, I'm sorry, Dr. Marks.
I didn't say anything.
Okay. I cleared my throat, I'm sorry.
Oh. It removed the severability clause. That's not true. And then it's nice. We still had an old effective date, which is not necessary. Policies are always effective at the regular meeting, the point of the regular meeting where the board adopts the minutes from the meeting where the action is taken. So that's not necessary. So although it's been a while, there's not heavy substantive change to the text or the requirements for the district, other than cleaning up and making it much easier for those to follow, and then where to find all of the 99 WAC definitions that are related to environmental policy compliance. So this is not a, it's important to our community. It's important to our region and how we contribute to that. But it's nice to know that even though we had not taken a look at this in a while, our language was not that outdated, and our practices then, as a result, were not out of compliance.
Dr. Harmon, could you elaborate on that bullet point where it says, maintain wherever possible an environment which supports diversity and a variety of individual choices? What is meant by that exactly?
And so we always talk about, and so in Kent, we've always talked about and celebrated our diversity and cultural inclusion. And so I think that speaks to how that is represented in everything, could be as far as everything that is what our outdoor spaces look like, the art we choose to put up in our buildings or on our buildings, all of those pieces could be there. Of course, this model policy is written for all districts in Washington state to use if they choose. And so that means that the environment would look very different in every community, or could look very different in every community, because it's going to result in that community's priorities, that community's interest. And I think that some of that is done in our buildings. Our principals, our building leaders and building staff are definitely trying to do that. And so it's always a reminder of how we can contribute and show up and express that inclusivity.
Do we have some kind of a, I mean, this to me, I mean, this is not about policy, but going through our buildings and stuff, and I've been in several of them and seen inside lots of different examples of cultural diversity, but I'm wondering, do we have some kind of an overall person that's in charge to kind of looking at that and seeing if we're enacting any of that? I mean, whose responsibility would that fall under, Dr. Watts, or is that even really a responsibility? It's just something we do. I mean, because a child walking into an environment, even on the outside, or a student, if they see something they recognize, it becomes welcoming. And this, to me, plays into that. And I'm wondering if we are somewhat paying attention to that. I mean, there's a lot here, but
Can you, I was
I
just
don't know
wondering,
how
can you,
one
Chris? Yeah, I was just curious.
person, yeah, one person couldn't do that because one
Yeah.
person's not aware of everyone's cultural,
Right.
right? So I think it's well, the way that I've known it to work is buildings kind of, they have student groups, they have parent groups, they have clubs that are multicultural.
Absolutely.
Those are the organizations. It's not one person that would be, you know what I mean?
okay. I mean, I get that. I just wondered if, if that one person kind of had a contact with all these people and just said, oh, we did this and we did this. And that would be something you could post, like, when I walked into Pine Tree and I saw all the things on the wall about their ethnic studies and stuff. And I was looking at each one of them and I thought that was interesting. When I walked into Covington Elementary during the Martin Luther King, when we could walk in to a thing, the thing was last year, and they had different things on the wall. But I mean,
Absolutely.
I'm not saying one person could oversee all that. It's just like, if you could shoot it to somebody and say, this is what we're doing and doing in different buildings, it's a concrete example of how we're trying to carry out that equity and diversity. And we could just, it's marketing to me. I'm always thinking marketing, that here we're doing all this, we're trying to do this. And do you have any suggestions of other things we could do? I mean, I love the way that different cities are now taking all these electrical boxes and stuff and beautiful paintings that are on them. When I'm driving places, I see all these beautiful things that kids and students and art majors have done. And it makes those things stand out in our community. They don't look like eyesores anymore to me. So just wondering.
No, I appreciate the wondering and the question. And you mentioned marketing, and I've heard you mention that before. And I say that to say there's not much difference between, so I'm making a connection between marketing and teaching. I mean, really, it is about teaching, not just telling. And I will give credence and credit to policy. This is a perfect example of where your governance as a board and the policy that supports race and equity is an expectation now. And the goal is that this is part of our culture, our environment. And so when you ask if there's one person, this is a perfect example where if and we often say this in our leadership team conversations, if everyone owns something or owns the expectation or the practice that something is happening, then no one owns it. But in this case, if the expectation is that everyone is responsible for ensuring that our rich, diverse culture is represented at each one of our schools, and when we are looking at COVID in the rearview mirror, at some point we can get back to in person and actually walk the halls, you would see, I think, more examples within our schools, our principals, our building administrators, our teachers, in our classrooms, in our instructional materials committee. We are focused on ensuring that the broad depth and breadth of our diversity in Kent School District is represented in our teaching.
Yeah. And I think about it, I mean, we also have to be careful. We don't want it to be the exception. We want it to be the norm, how we do things, right? And as it becomes a culture. So I think maybe sharing, look what we're doing. I think that kind of eliminates it from becoming a part of the norm of how we do it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So I think it becoming a part of the culture, it would just be normal. This is what we do. So this isn't, this is what you see. We don't necessarily have to share or call out or show that we're doing it. It's just what we're doing. And so I think you have to consider that as well.
That's a good point. That's a valid point. Yep.
And I think also to consider that those building leaders, also this policy, that one bullet in this policy also encourages and gives them authority to, do that in their buildings.
Oh, absolutely. And part of
And
that
there is a-
culture piece is just like we're heading into February, and oftentimes we look at February as, you know, as celebrating President's holiday, celebrating Valentine's Day, and certainly celebrating Black History Month. But it shouldn't be the only time that we are
Right.
speaking
I
about
agree.
heroes who are of African
Right.
descent in this country.
Right.
And that's an example where
Absolutely.
culture, you know, it moves beyond just the celebration of
Right.
the episode.
Right.
Yeah.
And quite often our building administrators will reach out to each other and ask for best
Yes.
practice or share
Absolutely.
best practice. So there is very much a network and conversation of, hey, we were doing this, or we were thinking about doing this. Does anyone have an idea? Or, and so there are sharings of ideas, but this does give it a new lens, and thinking about what that looks like from I think, a public facing perspective. So a lot of times you see that when you enter a building. And of course, it also references our commitments to recycling and valuing resources. So,
yeah, especially if it's student driven. That's also some of the buildings I've been in that the art I appreciate the most. You know, the murals and stuff that you can tell are student driven too, or done, is inspiring.
okay, so I don't hear any major opposition or questions or need for feedback. So I believe that this will be presented to you at the next time for second reading and approval. Making a note for me too. And we are at the end of our agenda for the policy slated for review, and so just won't ever resist an opportunity to take a few minutes to talk about next steps in our next meeting. And so our next meeting, like I said, is the end of March. And so obviously a couple of these will, well, one of them in particular will come back. So we'll have probably a more robust conversation around 5005 and 5111. I've been writing a little bit. We're going to have policies coming to you around appropriate and responsible use when it comes to technology. So what are expectations for students and staff to preserve the financial resource, but also interactions. So what does it mean to be a responsible user of technology in our interactions with each other, as well as the actual hardware itself? And we have a couple of other essential policies on the list that need to be reviewed just in our normal cadence. And I would fully expect that as we get into spring, there are going to be a series of policy updates related to COVID. So there will definitely be use for our March session. And then at that point, we'll probably start to consider, and you may see something from Karen before that point in time, about scheduling something beyond March, because I think March was our last scheduled one, but depending on what's the cadence and mood from the state about other updates to policy related to COVID, we may need to schedule an additional session, at least one more work session before the year concludes.
And just kind of circling back, because our last meeting, I remember Mr. Christie was here and talking about some policies. Are those going to be coming back in March?
That's the March, yes. That's the March around, yeah.
Okay. And then when we change 4312 to 4220, there's no policy yet. And so the 4312 policy is gone. So procedure is gone. So we have a 4220 policy, but no procedure to accompany it.
Okay. All right. I will put that out there and make sure that comes back to the board as informational as well.
Okay, great.
I was not aware, but not a problem.
Great.
And so with that concludes my portion of policy update. Thank you all for your time. Great. We hit just about right. Now I'm getting a better sense of cadence, and we probably could have snuck in one more. But I always like us not to leave a list or stop halfway. So I'm glad we're able to get everything done today. And thank you so much for that time.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr. Harmon,
Thank
as
you, Dr.
always.
Harmon.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
I just want to say that there's nobody here who could do a better job. I think
I'm sure somebody could.
Dr. Harmon in this. So thank you so much for the way you conduct all of these sessions. We really appreciate your knowledge and your ability to listen and come forward with responses. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, so I guess
Have a
with
great
that,
Saturday.
we are
That
adjourned.
concludes
work
our
session's
session.
adjourned.
Absolutely. Take
Thank
good
you.
care.
Guys have a
Stay safe,
wonderful
everyone.
weekend.
All
All right.
right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.